Sound check. Check 1, 2. Yeah. Check 1. Check 1. Check 1. Yeah. 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 Check 1. Yeah.
morning to the SATAC roundtable discussion on partnership with the Mail and Guardian. My name is Jeff Setswe. I work for the Oram Institute, and I am a messenger from the SATAC Secretariat to do the welcome and to introduce the moderator for today's session. We have a massive lineup of speakers to discuss the strengthening health research development funding in South Africa, and I want us to enjoy the session today. For those who are connecting online, I hope you're able to connect already. Just a little bit about SATAC before I introduce the moderator. The South African Health Technologies Advocacy Coalition, SATAC, is a coalition that advocates for an enabling environment for research, development, and access to life-saving technologies and innovations. It consists of a wide range of stakeholders that are involved in health, R&D, advocacy, and/or implementation. So SATAC supports evidence-based policy change and implementation, improved coordination of health R&D funding mechanisms, and a coordinated advocacy approach. So SATAC is pleased to collaborate with the Mail and Guardian in today's session. And let me take this opportunity to introduce your moderator for the session. And I have a short CV to read of Mia Malan, the CEO or Chief Executive Officer of the well-known Vaccinated Center for Health Journalism. Mia is the founding editor-in-chief of the Vaccinated Center for Health Journalism. She has over 25 years of journalism and institution building experience in legacy, excuse me, and digital native publications, working in newsrooms and at media development organizations in Joburg, Nairobi, Washington, D.C. Mia has won over 20 African Journalism Awards. Most recently, she won the 2022 Standard Bank Sivukile Journalism Award in the editorial/columns category. She is a former Knight International Journalism Fellow of the International Center for Journalists and a Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism Fellow at Oxford University. Mia serves on the Council of the South African National Editors Forum. Great achievements. Let's welcome Mia to moderate the session.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Jeff. I appreciate it. And I'm very, very excited about today's discussion because we have speakers from such diverse backgrounds, and that always makes for very, very good conversation. They represent the pharmaceutical industry, the South African Medical Research Council, which is the government's largest distributor of health research funds. And then we also have civil society, which holds both government and the pharmaceutical industry accountable for their actions. But before I introduce our panelists today, I'd like to set the context for our discussion, after which each of our panelists will make an opening statement of about 8 minutes, and then we'll proceed to a Q&A session, during which we also will have questions from you as the audience and comments to which the panelists can respond. So the reason we are here today is to take stock of where South Africa is as a country with its 2% commitment from National Health Department funds or the National Health Budget to do research and development with. We also will look at factors that influences the government's ability to stick to such a commitment, and then we'll look at ways that work to track the distribution of such funds. So where does the 2% commitment come from? As many of you in the room today will know, that there have been several declarations that South Africa has been part of, and in which many countries committed to give 2% of their national health budgets to health research and development. And these include the Mexico Declaration of 2004 and the 2008 Bamako and Algiers declarations. And in our country's case, our National Health Research Policy that was published in 2001 also proposes a 2% commitment. So has the government honored this commitment? Well, the short answer, as many of you would know, is no. And the longer, more complex answer is no, but most other countries have not stuck to their commitments either. So how do we know this? Well, there's an annual GFinder report that is published by Policy Cares Research that shows us that South Africa has repeatedly made the list of top funders globally for health research and developments for diseases such as HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. We rank number 12 on the list of top funders behind high-income countries such as the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And when it comes to low and middle income class countries, South Africa has the highest R&D spend in this group. But nonetheless, the actual government spend on health research has consistently fallen below the 2% target. So how do we change this? And more importantly, how do we track how research funds are allocated? And tracking is complex because the funds are spread among many different bodies such as the South African Medical Research Council, the National Health Laboratory Service, the Human Sciences Research Council, and also universities and non-governmental organizations. But we equipped for that discussion today because we have 3 panelists who will help us figure out the way. Let me introduce you to them. And as I introduce you, you can come to the stage. We're going to start with Professor Richard Gordon. Richard, you can come to the stage. While he's walking up, I'm going to tell you more about him. He is the Director of International Business Development at the South African Medical Research Council. And Richard was previously the Executive Director of the Grants, Innovation and Product Development groups at the SAMRC, where he oversaw most of the body's grant funding. He's also one of the drivers of the World Health Organization's Mrna Hub that was announced last year. Welcome and thanks for joining us today, Richard. Our second panelist is Dr. Morena Macwani, who is the CEO of the pharmaceutical company Biovac. His mandate at Biovac is to build vaccine manufacturing capacity in Southern Africa. During his tenure, Biovac has secured 3 successful technology transfer with global pharmaceutical companies such as Sanofi and Pfizer that has allowed Biovac to grow its staff from 24 to over 400 members. Thanks very much for joining us today and for your time. Lastly, we have Fatima Hassan, who is the founder and director of the Health Justice Initiative. Fatima is a human rights lawyer and social justice activist, and also the former director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. And as many of you will recall, Fatima also acted for the Treatment Action Campaign in many of its legal cases to make HIV treatment available in South Africa's public health sector. I now would like to ask each of the panelists to make an opening statement of about 8 to 10 minutes, after which we'll have a discussion about what they said and also get your input as the audience. We're going to start off with Richard, who is going to have a PowerPoint presentation and tell us more about the funding of the South African Medical Research Council and what they do with that, how they distribute that. Thank you. I'm going to sit on that side and then you can sit here.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you. It's very nice to be here and to see friends and family, quite literally family, my parents in the audience. So it's very nice to be here. And I thought I would give a bit of a snapshot. When I looked at the topics for today, I thought, well, I need to give some context. You know, what does the MRC do? Who are we? What do we fund? what do we fund, and where do we fit in the ecosystem? And then I thought I would end off with just a couple of provocative kind of case studies, which I think will lead into some of the questions that might feature later on. And to show you some of the things we have been involved in and people have probably seen every day for the last 2 years and did not realize we were involved. Thank you. So very briefly, so the Medical Research Council falls under the Department of Health. We receive approximately 50% of our spend from Treasury to the Department of Health. And essentially we do three things. We do research, we fund research, and we make research grants. Think of us that way. And roughly split 40% internal research, 40% external grants, and 20% around overhead. So that's effectively how we operate. We have the intramural research is really based around the burden of disease. So we have a very large HIV research group, a very large TB research group, gender-based violence, violence and personal injury. We have a malaria research group. So that's how we target a lot of our research. And in the extramural side, there aren't many A-rated scientists in South Africa who don't receive MRC funding for what they do. So names who are on TV, most of during the COVID pandemic were effectively MRC extramural research units, but it's not normally televised that extent because they're mostly universities at that stage. When it comes to grant funding, it's quite complex. And this is a unit that I used to run at the MRC until 2020. But essentially, it started out as a very small incubator to try and develop local products, vaccines, drugs, medical devices, and it just mushroomed from there. International partnerships with other governments, partners such as Gates Foundation, the UK government, the NIH, lots and lots of different collaborations, because Africa is actually a very sexy place to do research and research collaborations, because we have some very good scientists, and people want to work with our scientists. And I see several of them in the audience today who the US and the UK and Europe want to come and work with because we know what we're doing in the space. So the kind of the things that we would be funding, if I look specifically at this kind of program, we would be funding programs and treatments, not necessarily new drugs, but a lot of the formulations that were developed for Africa don't work in Africa, right? They're the wrong dose, they're the wrong delivery. We have different BMIs to people in other parts of the world. So reformulation of treatments specifically for African needs. Diagnostics, I'll give you a couple of examples on the next page. Vaccines, you can't be in Africa and not work in vaccines, and I'll talk a little bit about a couple of examples a bit later on. And obviously in prevention and all the things that go on with prevention. So very busy slide. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of these things you would have seen in the media, but JPIMR is the Joint Program of Antimicrobial Research. It's 29 countries. I sit in the Global Exco. It really looks at the drug resistance profiles of things that are going on in the world. The Grand Challenges Program, that's a big partnership with the Grand Challenges, the Bill Gates Foundation, Grand Challenges Canada, Brazil, India, and Grand Challenges Africa, really trying to coordinate and harmonize some of the research that gets done in Africa. Just on the COVID side, a lot of people will have seen my boss, Glenn Gray, in the media throughout the COVID pandemic. And there was a lot that was done in South Africa, and MRC was heavily involved behind the scenes. Many of you will be aware of the Sosonke trial. That was a program the MRC essentially initiated and started and saw through to the end with a number of the clinical partners in the room to vaccinate our workforce, 500,000 people. That was essentially done all in 3 to 4 months. That was a program that MRC were heavily involved with. We raised all the money for the trial and got the vaccines here from Janssen. And then everyone keeps talking about vaccines and vaccine inequity in the world during COVID. Well, I can tell you the same story about drugs. I can tell you the same story about diagnostics, and I can tell you exactly the same story around the supply of reagents and diagnostics and machines to do PCR testing. It was exactly the same. So most of you may or may not know, because we don't have malaria in South Africa very much. We do have it every now and again. But the worldwide supply of antimalarials dried up overnight when India closed its borders because of their Delta wave epidemic. So the world supply of antimalarials effectively dried up overnight. So this whole model of supply over the COVID pandemic has really been highlighted by this. But in diagnostics, we did not have any homegrown diagnostics to do COVID testing. We couldn't buy reagents to put in PCR testing platforms. We couldn't get any of these things because essentially we came last in the line when it came to buying the reagents. So the MRC funded 2 projects for COVID diagnostics. One with a company called Medical Diagnostic, one with a company called Cape Bio. Cape Bio, the CEO of Cape Bio got an award from the president about 3 weeks ago for young innovative scientists. This was a project MRC funded for these were the first 2 SARPRO-approved COVID diagnostics done in South Africa. And the reason we had to do it is because we couldn't get tests that worked here and that were validated. So that's the kind of the role we played in that space. And funders that we never really even knew existed, well, I certainly didn't, just started coming out of the woodwork. People who were really eager to give back. Solidarity Fund is one we all know about. Elmer Philanthropy, we had never really worked with Elmer. They were amazing with the funding they gave for a number of the programs we have here. The Michael and Susan Dell Foundation came in. So all new funders came into the mix. We weren't relying on necessarily other countries' governments. It was essentially alumni from South Africa who were very wealthy living abroad wanting to get back in several of the cases. Many of you will know this project. Didn't know that this was an MRC initiative along with the DSI. This is the Network for Genomic Surveillance. I remember sitting in the hospital parking lot of my father-in-law, who was in ICU at the time, talking about this program during COVID. This is the program that brought you the diagnosis and discovered the beta and the Omicron variants. Rightly or wrongly so, it cancelled Christmas in South Africa for 2 years in a row. But this is something that we led the world in, and how other countries are trying to replicate that it was done. But it wasn't one group working together, it was a network of many universities and laboratories trying to standardize this. And this was a massive undertaking. And you've all seen the man with the ponytail, Tulio de Oliveira, all over the news at various stages being asked by the different medias about what does this mean for the wave and the Delta and Beta and Omicron. So that was a very significant project that we ended up funding during the COVID pandemic. And moving to more recent times, and I left this as the last kind of case study, was the WHO's calls for the Mrna Hub, that South Africa were awarded as a consortium. And this was essentially a consortium of 3 different parts. The first part, many of you, if you haven't been on planet Earth, would not have seen Afrigen. Afrigen is really the host of this hub. It's a very high-profile announcement with our president and President Macron from France. This is the development of a local mRNA-based technology to replicate as close to a Moderna vaccine that we can get, just to demonstrate that we can do it. Component 2 was transferring this technology to spokes around Africa and in Asia and in Latin America. The first spoke is sitting on my right, Morena Biovac, is to receive that technology, and we're very glad to put this consortium together. And the third objective is really what the MRC is doing, and what I'm more involved with is how are we going to make it sustainable, that we don't invest in these facilities in Africa, and then COVID's gone, and no one wants a COVID vaccine. What are we going to do? So this is developing a pipeline for potential vaccine candidates by using a network of researchers in South Africa. And I'll just show you a very couple of quick examples. So this was the announcement. You have Tedros, the DG from the World Health Organization, and this is President Ramaphosa and President Macron making the announcement in June last year. And then the world's basically gone mad. This has just taken over a lot of some of the emphasis, and there's so much excitement around this program, which was regarded as one of the most interesting and exciting projects in global health that's going on at the moment. And it's really nice to be part of it. And I suppose the key message to put it out there is that this was not the MRC applying for an MRC grant to fund MRC researchers. MRC is actually not really part of the research component. This is getting VITS to make a construct, to then give it to UCT to test the construct, to give it to Afrigen to formulate the construct, to then try it in preclinical testing. And when it gets to that point, it goes back to Afrigen and then to Biovac to manufacture. So it is an intricate, and many of these projects were already funded by the MRC. This is not something that we just brought out from nowhere. These were projects that were already being funded with different aspects. But bolting them together into one program to make local innovation was really the step that the MRC really did to join us. So this is a model you see a lot more of going on in South Africa and in Africa at the moment, where there's one institution trying to do everything by themselves. Nobody funds like that anymore. It's really about getting collaborations and networks of researchers working together. So I'm going to stop there and just to say this is what the MRC does. And just to give you a case study of some of the types of things that we have funded during COVID, more recent examples just because it is relevant and put into context for the kinds of things that we are doing. So I'll stop there and hand over to you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Richard. Morena, we're going to move on to you. Would you like to sit down or would you like to stand there?
Let me stand because I
Okay.
always get busy with my hands. Thanks for the invitation. I think these topics are quite important, and well, firstly, because we should be reminded that we're still in a pandemic, and the question is, what is it that we can do differently, for the next pandemic, even though we don't know when that next pandemic would be. And since this is a research topic, and as much as I'm coming from a pharmaceutical company, I'm just going to try and use global examples and local examples about how difficult it is to tap into research as a company. Talking about the difficulty doesn't mean that we can't do it, because we have, just as one example, the likes of MRC that are there and many other entities that can help us be a more research-based country, and for pharmaceutical organizations in South Africa to be a little bit more research-based. But let's just use a few examples, because let's talk about the headlines in terms of the names that have been heard in the past 2 years. Okay, so a lot of you have heard about Pfizer, a lot of you have heard about J&J as an example, and most of you, if not all of you, and I hope, got either J&J or Pfizer vaccine locally. Now, those are big pharmaceutical companies that are involved in vaccine manufacture. But if you have to have a look, the large part of their revenue is actually generated from the pharma side, from the pharma division of. So there are global companies that have a vaccine arm, but they're actually a pharma generated in terms of their not the original revenue, but a large part of their revenue is tapped from that. Now, why am I making this example? Is that a lot of the times when companies get into these divisions, they use the profits that they have, that's on the pharma side, to either develop a new wing. And Pfizer, as an example, were not in vaccines prior to 2006. They acquired another company called YF, and that's how they got to be in vaccines. Even J&J was not in vaccines until they invested about 10 years ago in terms of getting into that. So I'm describing the names that you hear in terms of how the funding for some of the research that they do comes typically from the profits of, call it, their other arms, which is pharmaceuticals, okay? Then let's talk about two other names that many of you have heard of: Moderna, BioNTech, okay? These names were not known, quite frankly, even to me. I didn't know those names even prior to this, because there were small biotech companies, one based in Germany, one based in the US, and we didn't know about them, okay? And they developed, and now we know about this mRNA, okay? And they've made lots of money after. But how were they existing before? So both of them were listed on NASDAQ, okay? And they had venture capital funding, which means at-risk funding, okay? That the investors would put in and say, okay, this mRNA, do this and do this. And they've been at this for more than 10 years in terms of doing this with zero profit, essentially a loss. But they are in environments where there's a lot of venture capital that would go, where the money would go into some of that work. And now they're big names and they're big blockbuster names. So using this example of multinationals and small biotech companies, in South Africa, we're a small country, we don't have a venture capital, we don't have big brothers. What do we actually do, in terms of having that capacity, okay? So I'll talk about BioVac, firstly because I work at BioVac, but also because it's a real South African story in terms of how we are trying to do it. We're still not there, the destination is for. So in setting up a vaccine manufacturing entity, you must understand that the costs are high. Whether you're manufacturing a vaccine or not, you have expenses that are going through. So you must make sure that, if you have your facilities and you have your people, at a minimum about 500 million rand a year just goes to expenses, maintaining the facilities and ensuring that everything is maintained, even if you're not producing. Okay, so 500 million rand must just be somewhere. Okay, so I think that is something that is quite important. Now, with that, obviously, you need to generate revenue to make sure that first you cover your expenses. And so how we went about it was to not, in the initial days of BioVac, was to firstly distribute vaccines, get some revenue going, and start building and raise funds for the manufacturing facilities. And now when we go to manufacture, the question is, okay, we needed to raise some debt funding, and we need to get ready-made products, because we do not have the luxury of developing and researching, because we just don't have the environment here to do that. So that's how we got to partner, firstly with Sanofi, which is a French multinational, and then we partnered with Pfizer on their products, okay? That brought know-how and experience. And yes, we don't own those products, but that brought South Africans to know how to handle a very complex combination vaccine, how to handle a very complex, what they call a conjugate vaccine. And now, more recently, how to handle an mRNA vaccine. Yes, we're not manufacturing the raw materials here, but we are doing, on some of them, we do what we call formulation for finish, which is a blending and filling, and that's how we got the experience. Now, a lot of pharma South African companies probably end there. You know, just when you look at whoever's manufacturing in South Africa, they are just manufacturing, they're not going any upstream. And a lot of them are not even doing the raw material manufacture, which is sometimes referred to as drug substance. Some of them are doing, but it's not at large scale. So the South African typical phenomenon is you get the raw material, you convert it, and then you sell it, which for vaccines could work, and we've shown that it can work. However, maybe BioVac is a little bit mad, okay, or clever, or in actual fact wants to actually fulfill this dream. Yes, it's taking a long time of having end-to-end manufacture. So that at some point we are like a BioNTech, at some point we are like a Pfizer, and so we've tried to go upstream. And so some of the initiatives that Richard has spoken about is just about one of the initiatives where we need to partner. We need to partner with those that can give us the technology, that can develop that technology. So we're partnering on one example in terms of the hub. We have another program with the Gates Foundation that we're also going to initiate quite soon, where we are going to do development. Now, there's a difference between research and development. Our company is not going to go into research. It's expensive. We don't have the bandwidth, and we are just at the moment just trying to survive. Okay, but the dream is still there, and the dream is to make sure that we are end-to-end manufacturing. And so we want the technology to not only come in, we want to develop, we want to take the product through clinical trials. We want to end up owning the intellectual property and ultimately distributing it globally. We're not yet there, though. That's what I wanted to say. But we have a vision, and it's always been the vision, and slowly, I'm sure we will get there. But Mia, maybe let me pause here, and then I'm sure we'll get more questions later on.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. What always strikes me about you, Morena, is that you explain it in normal language, and not like a pharmaceutical CEO. Yeah. So our last speaker is going to be Fatima Hassan, who's going to make the introductory remarks. Thank you, Fatima.
Thanks. So obviously, my job as a civil society representative, coming from the legal profession, is to point out the potential pitfalls. Because the questions we have to ask ourselves today is, even if we advocate for all the funding in the world to do important clinical research here in Africa, or in parts of Latin America or Asia, which is sometimes in a very derogatory way called the global south, based on World Bank classifications of whether you're a high-income country or a low middle-income country or a low-income country, is that what is the point of all of this research and funding if it's only going to benefit the global north and the very rich first? And I'd like to caution that we are being used. And I'll explain why, and I'll give you some suggestions of how we can remedy any potential for exploitation as well as current exploitation. And I'm sorry, but we can't couch it in fancy language anymore. We've been saying for the past 2 years, because of the COVID example, despite all of the stuff that you've worked so hard to do, we were last in line for vaccine access. We took part in 4 clinical trials, now 5. We were not guaranteed priority access. So we are doing research based on excellent A-rated scientists that we have in South Africa, Latin America, Asia, but also because of our population, disease burden and profile. And let's not forget that it's communities that are driving the clinical trials, but they're not extracting benefit immediately, and in some cases, even at all. So we can fund as much as we want. We can pass the laws of increasing the percentage from 2% to 5% to 10%. It won't matter unless you have the freedom to operate. And we're going to talk about the hub and the risk to Richard's work and the hub in terms of the freedom to operate. and benefit sharing agreements. If we only think of benefit in terms of post-trial access for a trial participant, that's not sufficient. That's not enough. We've seen, the evidence of why that's a workable situation in COVID. So we need the freedom to operate, and we need true benefit sharing agreements that are now legislated, because unfortunately the pharmaceutical industry, maybe present company excluded, are not interested in non-commercial, genuine, non-exclusive access for everyone, everywhere in the world at the same time. Which is why Macron, who's on the one hand supporting the hub with funding, blocked the TRIPS waiver. But also, do you know what he did? When we were facing wave 3, when maybe you were sitting in the car in the parking lot, like many of us watching our family getting sick and dying because we didn't have the vaccines. We were last in line, remember? It was only the 500,000 donated batch for healthcare workers. Your granny, my friend living with cancer or HIV with a comorbidity were all waiting for vaccines. He flew in 2,000 vials of Johnson & Johnson when he came to South Africa for that visit. And do you know who those vaccines were for? French nationals living in South Africa. At the same time, we found out that Johnson & Johnson, that had given a fill and finish license to Aspen, which was celebrated as something so significant, that those supplies were leaving the Eastern Cape for a period of 4 months. 30 million vaccines left South Africa's shores, not for South Africans, because the priority customer was the EU. So when I talk about pharmaceutical power, and those are just 2 examples, let me tell you just quickly what the CEO of Moderna, Richard's being nice to Moderna, and so is Morena. But let me tell you why they're placing the most revolutionary radical mRNA technology transfer hub in the world at risk. When the breakthrough was announced late last year, that they've possibly you must help me with the technical terms, but possibly reverse engineered one component of a very important technology, not just for COVID. This hub is also for other neglected diseases, TB, malaria, HIV. We could have a vaccine for HIV. Imagine how powerful that would be, right? So that work that the hub is doing is not just about COVID. But when the breakthrough was announced, remember that Moderna is not cooperating with the hub, nor is Pfizer. They refuse. Moderna has filed patents in South Africa, which were granted by the South African government, very broad patents that have not even been recognized in other jurisdictions. In other places, they either lost their claim to a patent or they withdrew the patent because it was so broad. In South Africa, we gave it to them while we set up the hub. What did the CEO of Moderna say? Well, I don't know, is it really I'm paraphrasing, it's in the Financial Times. Is it really a breakthrough? I'm not sure. If you give me a fake Louis Vuitton handbag, he said this. Is it really the quality of a real Louis Vuitton handbag? I don't know. Let's wait and see. So the CEO of Moderna, one of the most richest people in the last 2 years, has become an overnight billionaire off the back of public funding. And that's why I say you can have as much public investment and funding if you want. If you don't address the IP issues and the systemic barriers and the power and control of the industry, you will have a technology that is sitting in the exclusive control of a CEO of a pharmaceutical company that says to the global south, in the middle of a pandemic, where 15 million people have already died in the space of 2 years, that your hub is like a fake Louis Vuitton handbag. Because why? Because it's a racist assumption that people in Africa, Latin America, and Asia cannot do science, cannot generate quality research. We heard these arguments in HIV/AIDS. We were told you don't need medicines because you can't read time. You won't be able to take your ARVs on time. Who said that? A US government leader. It wasn't even a pharmaceutical company. We were told in the middle of this pandemic by Pfizer, it's okay if you get a drip feed of supplies, which is why You all got your vaccines in a staggered phase, which is why most of you got Pfizer, because J&J never delivered on time because it was sending the vaccines to Europe. I mean, you have to think about how is it that all of a sudden our vaccine program went from something that was supposed to be primarily J&J to overnight going into a 2-dose Pfizer and then a 3-dose Pfizer and a 4-dose Pfizer. So we can have this target of 60% of all medical products must come from Africa for Africans in the next 2 decades. I think that's the target. But if you don't address the issue of IP, that's intellectual property, that's patents, copyright, confidential information, trade secrets, not just patents, then unfortunately you won't have access. Like we're seeing right now with monkeypox vaccine, clearly you have capacity to fill and finish or aspirin, but the Bavarian companies are holding on to the technology. We saw that with HIV/AIDS, we saw that with COVID vaccines. And so I just want to briefly say that if there's public investment in public research using public participation, then you have to acknowledge that the product is a public good. But that's not what's happening. And we have to deal not just with our IP laws as a country, but the global trade system of what's called the World Trade Organization, but also the university IP units. Stop supporting and participating in clinical trials where your university or your institution or your boss does not want to grant non-commercial use to the whole world, to everyone for a life-saving technology. If we don't have scientists supporting that goal, we're not going to get anyway. Even private investment in development of medical technologies actually indirectly relies on public resources. And there has to be a change in the way we approach how we deal with medical products. Even private investment, I would argue, still warrants a recognition that the end product is a public good. So I don't care if you want to research your Louis Vuitton handbag or your perfume or a car. You can have the IP on that. That doesn't have a material difference on my life and whether I can live or whether I can die. But a medicine, a vaccine, a diagnostic test, there has to be a recognition that that is a public good. And so unfortunately, what we have is a system where we are being given little crumbs. We make a noise, the South African president and Indian government asked for what's called a TRIPS waiver, a relaxation of intellectual property rules in the middle of a pandemic. Pfizer announces, with all due respect to BioVac, a small fill and finish license, and Johnson & Johnson's eventually gives a small fill and finish license to aspirin. It took so many months for Pfizer and BioNTech to say, okay, we'll set up bioantennas in Rwanda and Senegal. Moderna now, all of a sudden, after the hub is established, decides it's going to build a plant. It's first in Africa, in Kenya, right? So a lot of these responses that are couched in the language of access and equity are then just a ruse, we believe, because what's preventing you from giving over 100 manufacturers in the world that the New York Times identified exist in the global south? Give them the technology, share the technology. And I think the irony here is that both with Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, those were actually publicly funded vaccines. Operation Warp Speed, you know, this demand that there must be more public funding on the table in the middle of a pandemic was there. Governments, German government, UK government on AstraZeneca, the US government on Moderna and Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer as well, put the money on the table to socialize the risk, because we thought we'd get socialized access, but what we got was privatized access. And that's, I think, the warning of this pandemic. That's one of the key lessons, is don't assume that public funding is necessarily going to guarantee you full freedom to operate or to have access to the technology in the sense of the full IP. Right now, Moderna is being sued in the US for a patent infringement issue. So the jury is still out about whose technology is it. But in that time, it is affecting existentially the work of the hub, because it has not given a written assurance that it will not enforce its patents. The latest interview by the CEO of Moderna was yes, maybe they can develop the technology on the COVID-19 vaccine, but we as Moderna expect that our, as Moderna IP, will be recognized on all future vaccines for future diseases. This company is not going to sit back quietly when you develop that vaccine for any other disease using the mRNA platform. The potential for the 15 spokes, including BioVac, to commercialize and send product into other parts of the country is at severe risk, because unless you have those patents drop and unless you have it written non-enforcement and unless you guarantee the freedom to operate for each of those 15 spokes, then this is not going to happen. Moderna is going to decide what and when and who actually benefits from which supplies. So I feel like I've exhausted my 8 minutes and I probably should stop now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fatima, and for really highlighting very practical issues, because even if we use local government funding and if it's in collaboration with international funding, we face some of those issues. And I think the latest issue that relates so practically to what you've said is the cabotegravir HIV prevention injection that was trialed out in Africa, and now it's outpriced. We can't afford it, and we still don't know what the lower price would be that the company, the manufacturer, Viv Healthcare, has announced. I want to take our conversation a little bit back to specifically local funds and how we use our budget and how will we achieve that 2% target. So, Richard, when it comes to the Medical Research Council, how do you track who do you give a grant to and how much it amounts to? And it seems quite complex because it's not just the South African Medical Research Council that gets money. There's so many other bodies, also similar bodies to you, like the National Health Research, the NHLS, and also the Human Sciences Research Council. So what is the tracking mechanism? Because in the end, we need to know exactly how much money we got, where it went, and does it constitute the 2%?
Sure, that's a big question. So I can give you two answers to that. The first answer, if I take you back about 3 years ago, I used to sit on the National Health NHRC, and I chaired the sub-financing committee, and we did a straw poll where we sent around a questionnaire to all the main funders externally and in South Africa about how much they spent on research and development. And we came up with a number, and we published it in SAMJ about 2 years ago. And the answer is it's complicated. It's complicated on term definition. You spoke about health research. The term people like to use these days is research for health, which includes, social sciences, the whole continuum of care. And then, as you mentioned in the introduction, do you include higher education? That's where there's billions of rands going into from the government, which is also health research. And Department of Health, and then the DSI's money that they have. So it's very complicated to get to an actual number. But I agree with you. I think the number is well short of 2%, depending on whichever definitions you use of GERD or all of those put together. But it is growing. The MRC, if you're looking at the other side, the annual spend per year is approximately just over 1 billion rand, of which 45 to 50% of that is in grants that come in from overseas. And then we can tell you at any particular moment in time what is spent on HIV and TB, on malaria. You can segment it by university, by science council, by basic research or clinical research. That's quite well defined, but that is, if you assume 40%, that's 400 million rand a year going out in grants. That's, a tiny drop in the ocean. But there are other people who are funding that in South Africa as well. So I've given you a very long answer, but it is complicated because it's not just a binary, just going to Department of Health and asking them, you're excluding all the money going to higher education, centers of excellence, the NRF's works that they're funding in health as well. So that's not really answering your question, but it isn't as straightforward as getting a number.
So what would your suggestions be if we need a proper tracking mechanism so that we know if we did achieve or how far away are we from the 2%? What are your suggestions to create such a framework?
It's going to have to be intergovernmental departments, inter-research council agencies, I don't think we're that far away as we think, but I think the money is put into so many different pots that it's difficult to track. I think that's more the bigger issue. And then when you go to a treasury kind of level, if you ask Treasury for it, I think they wouldn't think of, the MRC's health systems research budget being part of that, or those kinds of examples. So it has to come from a governmental point of view where they get alignment. But I think the key thing is getting alignment on definition. What is it health research, which in the old-fashioned way was, your medical schools, your clinical trials, etc. Always research for health, which is community-based health, health system strengthening, and all of those things, which often are not included, but they should be.
Thanks very much. One last question. If you were to receive more money from the national health budget, do you have the capacity to use it and to allocate it?
Yes, we do. But I think the COVID issue, and the examples from the last speakers, the needle has now moved. 5 years ago, this is all about research and what great researchers have in South Africa. And now we became exposed to the global supply chain challenges. And, vaccines is the one we talk about, but as I said in my talk, it wasn't just vaccines, it was just about everything else. So we can do more research, but that doesn't guarantee you're going to get more products made. And, when Aspen got this massive funding to develop the J&J vaccine, and they didn't get a tender from Gavi, the world kind of woke up to say, well, you can put all as much money as you want into a company, but if the buyer is not going to buy the vaccine, you should sort that out first. So the answer to the question is yes, that money will be used because there are lots more people you can train, and there's lots more you can do with it, but that doesn't translate into getting more of your own products onto the market. That's got to be done at a way above my pay grade. But that's at a political level, and the IP side. The one last comment I will make, in an African context is, we keep talking about, the markets and the global access to markets, etc., and we keep comparing to China and India. At the worst case scenario, India's got 1 billion customers in one geographical country. China's got 1 billion customers. The US have got 250 million paying customers. We've got 50 countries making up that billion. So it's way more complex commercializing products in Africa than it is in just scaling something that works in the East. So I think it's a complex system, and I think COVID has just shone the light on the supply chain. And if we were to go to this point, we're kind of hitting the next brick wall, and then the next brick wall. So I think the IP is the next one that's in the crosshairs at the moment, and Morena mentioned a couple of examples as well. So I think it is, you're seeing the start, and that momentum needs to continue.
Thanks, Richard. Morena, I want to move on to you. So Richard has now mentioned that a market for your products is so much more complex here because you're going to have to deal with 50 countries and not 1 billion people in one country. Can you relate your concerns around that? But in addition to that, and I know it's 2 questions in one, an average person in South Africa, when you talk about your mRNA facility, would want to know, when am I going to see this and have the product, anything to do with mRNA that makes my life better? So if you maybe in simple terms could explain, how far are we away from seeing a product that people can use, and what type of product would that be? Would it, what type of vaccines do you think may translate into, and when will we benefit? So first of all, you can do my questions chronologically.
Okay. Thanks. I'll start with your last question about how far are we from getting homemade products. So I think again, going back to the definition of what do we define as homemade products? Is it the partnership that we have with Pfizer in terms of the vaccine that was traditionally coming from overseas that a lot of people got vaccinated, and when are they going to get that vial that will be coming out of BioVac in Cape Town? So so we're towards the end of the tech transfer now, probably about 80 to 90% there. So by the end of this year, we would have completed the tech transfer that will allow for full finish. We're equally worried about demand, like everybody else is, but we would have completed the tech transfer, which now having learned, just in terms of even full finish of that particular vaccine, the lessons that we would have had from when we signed July last year now, I think will certainly help BioVac even beyond the COVID-19, the Pfizer COVID-19 tech transfer. I think these intangible benefits that are so difficult to articulate, but and this is just the real capacity building and the things that would have been left behind. So that answers that question that in 2023 BioVac will be able to manufacture that type of product. But I suspect your question more relates to when will people see a vaccine that, yes, will be coming out of a BioVac site, but would have been developed in South Africa, where the raw material will be manufactured in South Africa at BioVac, filled, stored, and distributed, which I think is more of your question. When it comes to the mRNA vaccine, it's going into phase 1 clinical trials next year from the Hub. This is the one I'm referring to. And again, whilst it's still related to COVID, but we are hoping that somewhere around 2025, 2026, that we can have a product that can have everything South African claimed, right from the start, right to the end. Understanding that when I mention South Africa, I'm not only mentioning BioVac, but I'm mentioning Africa, I'm mentioning MRC, I'm actually Wits, who also was there. So it really will be a truly, and I think while that project needs to be supported, even though in 2025, 2026, we certainly hope that we'll be out of the pandemic, but let's assume that COVID is a little bit irrelevant in the public eyes. But it's so important because unless we go through that value chain, to get to do that on product 2, 3, 4, 5, we can't do it until we do. So this project is quite important in order for us to be able to have a completely homegrown vaccine as far as the mRNA is concerned. BioVac itself, we're having another project that we're looking with the Gates Foundation. Again, it will help about 2026, 2027, where we can also say it's a homegrown made vaccine that will come there. So it's not immediate, but having said that, it means the capability exists. And that we can do it with partnerships. I think what we do need though is that whilst we are celebrating and we have the likes of African and BioVac, but there are not a lot of companies that we can talk about in the same vein about that part of the value chain, product development, going through that hard slog. At the moment we're mentioning 2 in the vaccine space. I'm sure I can't even get to 5 if I even stretch my imagination. And this is in an upper middle income country. And I think, we need to have a lot more of these because my fear around it is that it can easily, when you start something and it's really hard, it's quite easy that this momentum can collapse because they may not be interested and we need to understand how long the road is. Going to your second question, and that's really, if you really have to ask me there are lots of things that keep me awake at night. But if there's just one that I can mention is really around the market. Because what is important for companies like ourselves is that whilst we do the hard work in terms of product development and all of these partnerships, you must understand that those partnerships are not going to give you any revenue, in the timelines that I've described, 2026, 2027. So how do you keep this engine going? Yes, you can get grant funding, but grant funding also has a window, okay? It says, okay, do up to this month, but also where are you get the additional funding? So you're constantly hustling between now and when the product is ready, knowing that the product is, there's risk involved. You may not even get to commercialization. So companies like ourselves, we try and keep ourselves relevant and to generate money off the back of a market. Now, where is the market? So in the South African and the African market, you can look at it from 2 angles. You have a direct market, okay, which is like South Africa. So we sell to the Department of Health. Department of Health issues tenders. We then go and we tender. Now you can say we're South African made, we're fine. Okay, you're fine. In actual fact, we're not. Because Department of Health and how they have structured their procurement is really open to anybody. So the fact that you're a local manufacturer does not necessarily give you any comfort. If an overseas player comes and is 30% lower, yes, BioVac continue and sort out your 500 million rand expenses. Quite basically, it's as simple as that. So the direct market, is a concern, and we need support in terms of the direct market. Going globally, because in the vaccine game, it's it's a very high intense from an expense perspective. So we can't rely on South Africa. And yes, whilst we want support from South Africa, but the end game is to get exported, a net export. It's a volume-driven game. So you then say, okay, who is this market that I can go to? Yes, it's difficult to get to the US and the EU because of the type of markets they are in, but there is what we typically would call the Gavi market. That's typically how we refer to it. So when you look at the African countries in terms of the number, the majority of them rely, very few buy vaccines out of their own fiscus, okay? Donors donate to this organization called the likes of Gavi. They procure for those least developed countries, which means that for us to be able to develop capacity, we have to target that market being Gavi. And there are certain criteria that you have to fulfill. Now, unfortunately, during COVID, whilst the Gavi market has been, Gavi must be praised from the time that they were set up, even up to COVID in terms of what they've done and the reach that they have. But I think part of the procurement mechanism and the systems that unfortunately got a little bit of exposed in that there's a lot of reliance on the likes of India, traditionally with routine vaccines. And not just in India, they've done well in terms of routine vaccines. But I think the mistake that happened is that people didn't think innovative. They did exactly what they did with routine vaccines. Oh no, we'll go to India, we'll go to India. We know that's a place that we can go to. And not really cast our net wide. And we paid the price. Okay, because as we all know, there were export bans. Okay. Now, for us to be able to have a sustainable business, and when I say we, I'm just talking as an industry, we need to have markets that can support us. We need local to support us. We need the likes of Gavi to say, Africa, we are actually supplying, Gavi's real existence is really around Africa when you look at it. Because 60% of that supply come to, so quite frankly, if there's no Africa today, or if Africa gets to the likes of Gavi don't actually exist. So, but what is missing is that they're working for Africa, but what has been missing thus far is to complete the value chain and say, we want products to also be made in Africa. And they have also reluctantly come to the party, and we're seeing some early signals that they're coming through. But if there's one thing that is important is for us to understand that anything will revolve around the market, and we can try all of these things, but we do need to have a healthy market. It doesn't need to be an expensive market, but we need to have a healthy market that can support us. We need to be kept on our toes to make sure that we're competitive and that we don't rip the market, because, as all of you have said, and Fatima said, some of the money really comes from public. So we need to be sensitive around some of those. Yet we do need to make sure that we cover our expenses, and that's important, and we cover our sustainability.
Thanks very much, Morena.
We're just changing my battery.
That must be a first.
You've had load shedding.
Yes, that's a very South African way of putting it. I have one question for Fatima, and then we're going to move to the audience to get all your comments and your questions. Fatima, from what Morena is saying is the market is so important, and it's not necessarily cheaper to produce medicines locally. It's often more expensive, and we saw that issue playing out a few weeks or about a month ago, if I remember correctly, with ARVs, where a local pharmaceutical company didn't get a National Health Department tender because they produced it at a higher price than ARVs that are produced in India. That is just more economical to bring in, but it has an impact on the sustainability from local companies. So do you think there should be a legal framework or a requirement from the National Health Department, that requires the National Health Department to procure larger proportions from local companies? Because I know they have rules that do it to some extent, but as Morena has pointed out, if there's a tender, he has no advantage over international companies in many instances.
Yeah, sorry, Morena, but so I think the approach that we take is that the right to import a cheaper version of the same medicine or a test or a vaccine so that more people in your country can benefit from it. When you have a tight fiscus, or South Africa, some people saying we're facing a fiscal cliff, you're facing a recession. I mean, we were in dire straits before the pandemic. It's even worse now. The most recent interview you did with the DDG was that now they potentially only going to implement NHI in the next few decades because there's no money, right? So, it's a tough balance, because when you want more people to access speedily life-saving interventions at the most affordable price, then unfortunately, it's very hard to advocate for a BEE or a local production element. But I think the difficulty that happened with COVID, and I think that is what's being lost in this narrative of, oh, poor Aspen, look, they got the license and now nobody wants that vaccine, is imagine if Aspen got a full manufacturing license on the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. Imagine if you got a full manufacturing license early on in the pandemic on the mRNA Pfizer vaccine, not just a fill and finish, because you're still only going to be able to get it out now. And sorry, you know, we've all received these vaccines, but they're yesterday's vaccines, they're last year's vaccines. The FDA has just approved new vaccines for the new variants. So what we were getting as a story was that why isn't COVAX or Gavi or whoever else in Africa ordering last year's vaccines for this year's variants for 2022? No government's going to do that. And so I think the issue that happened with COVID, because it was such a fast evolving disease, within months, AstraZeneca was the top vaccine, then not. Within months, let's all use J&J. No, not J&J. Let's use mRNA. I mean, J&J is like, I think the last on the FDA list is a choice. It's not even the vaccine they're using in the US. They're ordering mRNA vaccines, which is why I think the hub is so important. So I'm sorry to have to say that, but I think that is the reality, is that if BioVac, which is what we've been saying from the beginning, BioVac, Aspen, and many other manufacturers across Africa got the right technology transfer at the right time, then the first 6 months of 2021 would have looked very different for how COVID played out. And it would have looked very different for demand by December 2021. We lost months. We lost months because there weren't enough permissions given to manufacturers around the world who went to J&J and Pfizer and said, we can help you scale up, we've got existing capacity. The company BioLease in Canada said to J&J, give us the technology. This was in early 2021. We can make these vaccines. We've got a customer, Bolivia. We can vaccinate the whole of Bolivia with J&J. And they said no. So in 2022, it's August, they're still fighting about a compulsory licensing in Canada. We're losing time in a pandemic like this. Now, it's very different. Aspen's got the market on malaria and HIV. We fought for those licenses. That's how Aspen got it. But Aspen has to be competitive. You know, I'm all for waving my flag or whatever at some soccer or rugby match. But if Aspen's going to charge me more for an ARV or a malaria drug and is going to charge the rest of Africa more, then you have to get it from somebody else if it's possible, right? And so I think what COVID showed is that, oh, that strategy, and I think that's where you're coming from, may not necessarily work if the borders are closed, if there are bans in place, or if there's a supply chain disruption. Then you actually have to rely on your own region in your own country. And it's difficult because nobody has a magic crystal ball. You don't know when Modi is going to impose a ban. You don't know when the EU imposes a ban or the US, and they all did. They all imposed export bans, but they told us we couldn't impose export bans, which I think is a bit of the irony. So I think it's a more complex conversation around the vaccines and COVID and Gavi, and I think that's a conversation we must ring fence because it's a very different type of conversation we need to have around products that don't change that fast, that they don't change because of a new variant. I mean, first line ARVs, second line ARVs, it's the same. It doesn't necessarily change. But there are new products coming onto the market. And so the question I have to ask as a medicine access activist is I really love to support local, but not if an injectable PrEP for HIV prevention is going to be cheaper from a third company or a third country. So there could be some guidelines to prioritize, trying to support manufacturers from the global south. That could be one way. Because, the danger of pushing a very local only and local first is that a very similar thing, we could be on the receiving end of that in a very negative way from companies that are now being set up in Senegal, Rwanda, Kenya, Botswana. And so I think that's a danger. I don't have the perfect answer, but I think that affordability is actually going to be the driving issue. And I was just saying to Jeffrey earlier before the session started, if you read the NHI bill, then I think that question around procurement and affordability and what the government's going to be able to afford as a basic benefit plans is such a critical conversation to have, because if you're going to make the pot smaller, then the benefits are going to be smaller in the state sector. And you know, given that most of our government spend on healthcare is actually for medicines because they are patented, and our government doesn't want to issue compulsory licenses or take on pharmaceutical power, even with private medical scheme groups, most of the spend is actually on the acquisition of patented products and medicines. Then this is where the tension emerges, is affordability versus wanting to support local production or regional production, I think maybe a better word, versus access. Sorry for the long
If I
answer.
can just also
Sure.
come in there in terms of the structural, I think there's a structural problem in South Africa. If you take Department of Health's mandate, which is exactly how Fatima's described it as, we need to give access, we need to make sure that everybody gets access to medicines and healthcare. And the Department of Health has been asked to deliver on that mandate. And they obviously run procurement because they know the goods that need to go there. Now, whereas in general, nobody is anti-local manufacturing, whether it's vaccine. I don't think in principle people just have that concept doesn't clash. However, I think we find out the Department of Health sitting and having to look after healthcare, and to some extent, if there is a premium, which in some cases there isn't, but in some cases there is, they're also being asked to fund out of the same procurement model. And South Africa needs to find a different procurement model, because when you speak to DTIC, you speak to Treasury around the economic impact that you would have. And say, by BioVac employing 450 highly skilled people, of which obviously most of them are taxpayers, there's a whole industry that we're supporting. And I'm just making an example of us. I mean, there are other bigger pharmaceutical companies here. There is money that is going back into the fiscus, okay? And then the budgets get allocated to the likes of health. Now, this local manufacturing benefit, how to become a Silicon Valley, or is that the part of supporting local manufacturing? And it shouldn't be, I'm not saying that it should be exorbitant. Perhaps should not come out of the Department of Health. The Department of Health are delivering, and they should run their tender as competitive as they want to. And maybe there can be a structure that says, guys, but we do acknowledge local manufacturing. And if there's a premium, we will allow for a premium, but it won't come out of the health budget. It will come out of DTIC or Treasury, because they understand the broader industrialization. Because at the moment, we're asking the same department to provide healthcare, to support local manufacturing, and everybody's knocking at the door, which sometimes is unfair. So I just wanted to add that we could look at things differently structurally as a country.
I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in with DTIC about the debate about how do you grow an export market. And well, it's very difficult to grow an export market when we're not even buying our own products. So it's a system discussion, and I don't think it's a right or wrong answer, but it is definitely something that has got to be a very high priority.
Thanks very much, Richard and Morena. I would like to move to the audience to see if there are any comments or questions from you guys. If you don't have a specific question, you can also make a comment if you wanted to comment on some of the points that the panelists have raised. We have two there. Could you please introduce yourself, which organization you represent, and then ask your question? We can start with the gentleman here at the front. Yvette, you can go after.
Thank you very much. My name is Ndando Yola.
Can you maybe stand up, because it's hard to hear you? Yeah.
Let's do that.
Thank you.
My name is Ndando Yola. I am with two organizations, the Untitled Chapter Foundation, as well as an Advocates for Prevention of HIV in Africa, which is an advocacy organization. I think it's really great to hear, always when you come in this manner, you sort of get to understand what goes into what with regards to all of the work that you all are doing for the public good. And I think with all of what we've heard, really, which is really difficult to put it together, but in terms of the advancements that are being made, the bilateral agreements and the collaborations, as well as the business, the investments that are happening, and with underscoring that this is all for the public good. My question is, in each of the decisions that you make, especially Richard and Morena, how many times do you stop and think about communities, or shall we say the public, and for which all of this is for their good, especially from a public health perspective? And when that happens, what do you see as their role in advancing each of what you are doing? And because I think part of why we are in this sitting today is through the South African Health and Technologies Advocacy Coalition. And as I had mentioned at the beginning, that the information that we get from all of you is really the work that we are passionate about and interested in. And so Fatima, for you, once we hear from them, could you then, and I mean, I'm hoping, and we know that we're not expecting you to be going out to mobilize civil society to be part of your voices and all of that. So Fatima, when you hear their responses, could you tell us what you see as an organized and strong civil society in South Africa, so that we don't hear of such developments from whatever perspective only when we are here? And in fact, there's not as much community or advocacy or civil society representation here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Morena and Richard, are you clear on the questions?
Yeah, okay, 100%. Thanks for that question. You know, I think the issue of community engagement is quite important, and you know, and I think if there's one thing that COVID-19 has shown us is around how little we understand, even around adult immunization. I mean, I've been in the vaccine industry for a long time, and still today, I'm still not sure that we know that adult immunization in general, even pre-COVID, was not big. I mean, people hardly go for flu vaccine. You know, there's a pneumonia vaccine for the elderly, and it's really patchy. Okay, that was before COVID-19 vaccine. And I think with COVID-19, just has exposed how little we actually understand of adults, and particularly on the immunization front. You know, on the children's side, which is a space that, you know, we have been and will continuously be, I think we have a little bit better understanding and a lot more, you know, call it compliance, and you'll see it from what is called coverage data. So it's how many children are vaccinated in a year. You know, so our statistics, depending on who you talk to, hover between 80 and 90%, and sometimes there's a lot of debate about what is our actual coverage. So we get 1 million babies born in a year on average in South Africa, and about 800,000 of those each year get to be immunized. Now that program, whilst it has its gaps, but it's one of the well-run programs globally and locally. It's called the Epr Program that Department of Health runs. It's to make sure that, you know, to get to as close to 100% as possible. Now they obviously link it, you know, when the child comes for vaccination, they get weighed, they get vitamin A. So it's sort of like, you know, integrates nicely within the broader healthcare, and it's been there for a long time. And anyway, these are precious babies. Everybody, oh, if the baby does something, we go to a clinic. Now these adults, you know, we're still yet to understand what will actually make them go to a clinic. And I think that's an area that we certainly don't understand. Now, as companies, as I can only talk for my own companies, that we're certainly working closely with the Department of Health around things like vaccine delivery, just to make sure that vaccines get to the point and they get stored well. And then we do some education, but that we are only limited to what Department of Health can allow us to do, because you must understand the pharmaceutical area is also restricted. You can't go and advertise. You know, we're not like an MTN. There are rules that you can't go and do. And yes, we don't want to advertise. But also in your education, you should not be seen to as if you are brandishing your own brand, because these are healthcare products and these are complex, and the community sometimes don't understand. But I think we can, you know, and just using this terminology, mRNA, that everybody knows about, knows those 4 letters, but they are not well understood. You know, I think there's an opportunity, or we should use the lessons and say, how can we call it a complex thing like that, and take it more to communities? So I don't have an immediate answer. I just know what the problem is, particularly in adult immunization. And I think that's a world that we still need to understand.
So you probably asked the question to the person at MRC who does the least direct community engagement, because how we would do it, we would fund projects that ultimately the projects did the community engagement. So if it was a trial, the community engagement around trial testing vaccines, that's how we would get more involved in it. at a research level, the intramural units do it, the gender-based violence, the prevention, violence, injury prevention, the health systems. That would be the kind of things that we would do directly. Although I'm not directly involved, so please don't take everything that this is the official line from the RC, because I'm pretty sure it's not. But at a practical kind of level, there've been some, at the one end, rolling out, trying a HIV vaccine clinic, and then you have to obviously go and engage with communities and talk about it. On the IP side, there's the NIPMO and the IPR Act about that there's benefit sharing and all that can be done. And then there's also just day-to-day things when an innovator needs help with scaling and in the community. And I think a very simple example was we helped he was called the cycling man. I think you probably might have seen him in the media, but he decided that he was going to deliver medicines for his gran, and he would cycle in Khayelitsha and go and pick up her meds, and she'd give him like $5 to go for his time. And then he realized, if I went to the church on Sunday, if I had 10 grannies who needed their meds and they didn't need to take a day off work to go get their medication, I can do all of them. So he made 50 Rand for the day. And then he scaled that, and we helped him develop a cashless app to deliver. And I think about just before COVID, he was delivering tens of thousands of packages through a network of riders in Khayelitsha, then went to Google Air too, and he's now looking to franchise in other parts of the country. So that's very hands-on community engagement. All we did was helping on the technology side, not really the actual in the unit that I was in.
Quick follow-up and clarity.
Let's just get Fatima to respond. I know you have a comment, but I also want to give Yvette a chance to ask her question, and there may be more people in the audience. Sorry?
Yvette can first, and then I'll...
Quick clarity.
Just a clarity, okay, quickly.
Clarification.
But, I mean, I like how you sort of took my question as asking for community engagement when there are products at the end. And I think our discussion was really not about that. It's about, and I think, and maybe I didn't do a good job in asking the question, in the decisions that you make, which is what we spoke about. Not when we have a vaccine that is not even accessible, by the way, from what we're talking about, and many other issues that Fatima raised. Decision-making and processes. When, personally, have you took a decision that, look, we're looking at this grant agreement or negotiation. Is there a community on the table, or a civil society, or a public representation on the table to be part of these discussions?
I'm going to move on to Yvette's question, because I know you likely to ask to relate to the community as well, Yvette, and then when Fatima responds, she can incorporate your response to the previous question as well.
Right. Thank you.
Yvette, will you introduce yourself and also what organization you represent?
All right, thanks everyone. Good afternoon, or is it still morning? My name is Epr Program, and I'm the Executive Director for Advocates for the Prevention of HIV and AIDS, but I'm also known as the Shambok Feminist, so I hope you guys are ready. Richard, to your points in your presentation speaks so well of why South Africa is so attractive to research. And I want to beg to differ. It is not just our fantastic researchers. Hello, researchers. It's not just about it, but it's about the Black bodies who give their bodies to research, and how easy it is for Black and African people in South Africa to commit to research because we want to see something happen. And if you talk about some of the studies, I know in the nursing field that my sisters, my friends, my comrades were the ones who stood in line to say, I'll take this vaccine if it's going to help my patient, not even help me. To prove to my patient, I take it. I think you guys remember the dilemma we were in. So I think the point Ntando made about community comes from that. Is how do we include community from the beginning, and how do we see their role? And your presentation, very beautiful, but I don't see even a space of you thinking about the research advocacy community and civil society in that. I also want to say, I think the research sector has to commit, and all of us has to commit to transformation. These good researchers you're talking about is white females. Where is the Black female researcher who is always the second or the last name on these papers. I did say I'm going to be radical about it. And I'm also disappointed that we are sitting in this round table. We are using COVID, the rich auntie's child, as an example, with a recovery rate of 97%. When we have HIV in this country, in this world, in this country where young people are still being infected at the rates they are doing. And we know whatever technologies and research is a once-off capitalistic idea. We already see COVID in some of our heads. Who's wearing a mask? Who's still coughing? Very few of us. It's going to be over at some point, but nowhere in sight do we see an end to HIV or even an HIV-free future for our children. So I'd like us to rethink on how capitalistic we also are when we speak about these things. And thanks, Mia, for mentioning some of the struggles. And one of them is obviously the cabaret fight, the injectable PrEP, versus the Depiperin ring, which African women are clear that we want the ring. However, the gay white male is advocating for the injectable, which is easy and effective. And now we are almost like coerced into believing that will work for African women. So when we talk about how are we strengthening health research and development funding in South Africa, we must also think about it not being just a rich person's problem, but what HIV is still doing in this country and in the world for Black and brown women. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvette. Before we move on to another question, I'm going to ask Richard and Fatima to respond. Specifically to Richard, how do we make sure that communities have enough of a voice to protect their rights in research and their bodies, as Yvette said?
So I'm going to actually pass one of those questions to Salome, who does a lot of the clinical trial side and how the active community engagement happens, because I don't do that myself. So I would be making up an answer. But Salome, maybe you can just say on a clinical trial, how do you typically do community engagement, whether it's ORM or it's in a collaboration with MRC, etc., just to address that, because I would be making it up.
That's not the question.
Thanks, Richard.
I know, but
Yvette, I think we always don't give enough attention to community. I will very much admit that. I mean, we do have in a lot of the clinical trial sites, and I'm sure you're aware of that, we do have community advisory boards. They meet regularly. They are made up of different people from the community that we think give a voice to the community. And you know, for most of the projects, there's always engagement before and during, and report backs to the community advisory board. It is dependent on how active the board is, how active our community liaison officers are at making sure that that is happening. And I agree that, you know, we need to have that at the top of our agenda. Even outside of our clinical trials, there is now for most of our implementation research projects as well, engagement with communities, having community advisors on the scientific advisory committees, having community advisors, you know, as part of the investigator teams. So we try as much as possible to include, but I think it's always not enough. So we can definitely do better. And so that's what we do at the moment. But I agree with you that we need to do more. And we also need to look for solutions that are specific for us. I just wanted to say for the MRC, I was really pleased to hear that there is a gender-based violence and a violence and injury prevention unit. And, you know, very often, even within our organization, you know, I've like pushed that we do more of that kind of work. And then the answer is always, well, where were you going to get the funding? No one wants to fund that work. But that is the type of work that we really need to do in this country, because infectious diseases are important, and we're more likely to get funding from outside for infectious diseases because people don't want people from South Africa going and infecting them. But they really don't care that much about what's happening in South Africa in terms of gender-based violence and trauma and injury. And so we do need to invest more in those kind of things that are affecting our communities and not other people. So thanks.
Thanks very much. Fatima?
So, I mean, let me just be a bit provocative, right? So I think what has happened in the last 2 years is that finally there's actually a conversation happening about racism and decolonization of global health in clinical research. And I think that that is probably one of the first set of conversations we need to start having with all of the different research partners in South Africa, as well as government. Because I think your understanding of racism in research and my understanding in events are probably different, right? And when we talk about our communities, I think we're also all talking about different communities. Some people are talking about people who live in informal settlements. Some people are talking about middle-class communities in Sandton. And some people are talking of very wealthy people who live in Camps Bay, right? Because we have so many different disease burdens and profiles. And I think it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but it needs to happen. Because what is happening is that because of COVID and because of this global conversations happening, it's not just here in South Africa, but how do you decolonize research and how do you decolonize access? And it was quite evident in the International AIDS Conference that was held in Montreal recently, that more questions are emerging around the need for certain research, the clinical trial design, and the trial protocol. So just some small examples, and sorry to go back to the VIV example, but there are communities who were part of the CABLA trial in South Africa, in Latin America. There were communities who were part of the vaccine trials, who didn't understand, because nobody explained the trial protocol, that there would be no post-trial access. There are communities who are participating in a new Moderna trial in South Africa, which is a booster to a J&J, but the eligibility, I'm not even going into how the ethics committee approved this, but and these are run by proper research institutions. So I'm not attacking the credibility of the people who are working behind this. But why are we in 2022 doing a trial for Moderna, given the way it's behaved and its conduct in relation to the Mrna Hub, as a testing a booster to a J&J vaccine, right? And the eligibility was in early 2022, for people who were unvaccinated in South Africa, I think in KZN. So they were actively looking for participants after we've had 1 year of a vaccine rollout who had not been vaccinated, and then you get a stipend to be in the trial. And so when communities started asking questions and people like Tian and them at the African Alliance, you are seen as the troublemakers. And I think that's the second thing we need to deal with, is to understand that community and civil society create confidence in science and create confidence in this notion of what people are now calling Western medicine. But if you don't get communities on side, you don't explain the decision-making and the rationale behind why you decided to do this trial in this way with these scientists, with these research partners, with these kinds of conditions and strings attached, then people are losing faith in the potential of science and research to actually improve people's lives. And I think we saw that quite clearly with Viv and the CABLA thing. It was only because communities in 2022, after everything that happened with COVID, after everything that happened with HIV, wrote open letters, made a big fuss and noise. How did WITS agree to participate in that? I mean, what is going on here? WITS has some of the smartest people and the smartest, IP people. And we agreed to do a trial of something that some people are calling revolutionary for HIV prevention, given where we are in that pandemic. And there will be no generic manufacturers, they will not share the technology, and they will price it as a couple of $1,000s. And it was only because of the community. And so the third problem is there's a perception that communities feel that they are being used. You only call us when you want us to make a noise. But when we make a noise, people are not happy about that. We've been asking questions, we've been filing PAIA requests, we have to go to court, we have to sue the companies, and we get no support from government. We get no support from research institutions and partners. So that civil society or community and people living with HIV noise and protests and, the solidarity around the world of how can a company like that come to Africa and Latin America, Brazil, do this trial and then not guarantee generic entry. So now it finally has. And so we all keep quiet. But actually, if you look at the terms of that announcement, it may be up to 3 generic manufacturers. Maybe it will take 3 years for them to come onto the market. And in the meantime, Mia, we'll just wait. We'll lose 3 years of a prevention battle because we've decided to give all the power to VIV. But we took part in that trial. We contributed to that scientific research. So I think the fourth thing is an urgent convening by government. And I'm sorry, but the department always kicks the ball. Go ask the MRC, go ask BioVac, go ask Afrigen. The department has to be the custodian and government has to be the custodian, or the presidency. And whether we like it or not, I mean, it's not looking really good. The departments don't talk to each other. I think we have to be honest. So somebody has to coordinate this conversation of, we have to put a stop to not having proper benefit sharing agreements. Otherwise, I just think you're going to lose more and more community participation, or where that participation happens, it's going to be with so many strings attached, or it's going to be coerced. So sorry for digressing, but I think those are the 4, points that we have to highlight. If we don't come out of this pandemic with a proper framework for true benefit sharing, and that has to include state executive action, has to include compulsory licensing, because Moderna is not going to come and cooperate with the Hub. Not going to happen. Then we're not going to be able, I think, to go forward with this very important project of actually doing research for the protection of mainly people in Africa, and then to serve that. Can I just say something about Brazil, which is why I'm saying to you the VIV thing is a really good example. So what VIV did when it announced the license, because of the protest action and the pressure, is that it's included 90 countries, right? There's still confusion about whether our private sector will be included or whether they're separating the two and what the price will be. But they excluded Brazil. So if you think that this is not going to happen to South Africa, Brazil took part in the trial and they've excluded Brazil from the generic licensing arrangement. And, if we don't have a noisy, vocal South African civil society, that will happen. But I think even if you do have a noisy, vocal civil society like you have in Brazil, a company can decide whether to include you or exclude you. So sorry, Yvette, I'm not sure if I've answered it.
Thanks, Fatima. I would like to see if we can have one last question or comment. Let's have to Yolanda, right? And Yolanda's that person, and then over here. Before we go to closing statements.
Thanks, Mia. I'm Taonga. I'm from Perth, and just a few comments based on the presentations from our panel. I think first one, just in the spirit of the program title around strengthening health R&D funding. I think, Richard, you spoke about some of the other philanthropists that came on board as a result of COVID-19. There was Solidarity Fund, the Elmer Foundation, Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and I know as part of the advocacy agenda for SARTAC, one of our things has been we need to advocate for increased local funding for manufacturing for health R&D. So we'd just like to maybe hear from you on how do you think that in future we can get some of these local philanthropists to be a little bit more active in the health R&D funding space. And then Dr. Morena, I think you also spoke about how we are not producing currently raw materials, and the vision at some point for BioVac is an end-to-end manufacturing. So just wanted to get a little bit more, get a better sense from you on what that vision may look like, or if we're putting steps already in place to make sure that we're not coming in towards the end bit for the fill and finish, but really investing throughout and maybe even producing our own materials if that's a vision for South Africa. And then the other comment I had was around the worry that you mentioned around the demand side barriers, and just wanted to get a sense on what entities like SAMRC or BioVac or Afrigen are really currently doing to address some of those demand side barriers, and what we as an advocacy coalition can do to support some of that. And then lastly, just the conversation around the multilateral funding and procurement with Gavi. And I think even outside of the borders closing, from my perspective, as someone who's not an expert in the pharmaceutical industry, I would imagine that our goal should be to see the growth of the local manufacturing industry. And you already mentioned some of the structures around maybe DTI or Treasury putting in the premium. So really just wanted to get a better sense on how we can even advocate for growing the local pharmaceutical industry, or getting entities like Gavi to have, I don't know if it's trust that they need to have in the local pharmaceutical industries, and to possibly procure from local manufacturers. So yeah, those are the few comments from me. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I'm going to move on to Yolanda's question or comment.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think Taonga took a lot of my questions in her comments and briefs, but I just wanted to add one thing. I think maybe to just commend the South African government and the SAMRC, particularly for the investments that they've made in South Africa. I think this is really amazing work, and it's really impressive that we are here today with the infrastructure that has been built in the country, with the expertise and the capacity that has been built in South Africa. I think this is really, really amazing. And when we started as a coalition, I think this is the vision we had, to really have this capacity and the infrastructure and the homegrown technology. And we're really seeing this come to fruition. I just wanted to really, perhaps have a call to action, after this meeting, to say, can we come together as partners, civil society, academia, different stakeholders, to really make sure that we are keeping records? I think, it's important for us to track where the funding is going, how we are doing, not only for sustainability, but also just for accountability, And I think it's not good enough for the government to say, we are funding, but we can't really tell you where the money is going. I think that really needs to change. So maybe if the SMRC has a pot of money for CSIR to do this kind of research and set the framework for accountability, so that we're collecting this data systematically. And we, whenever asked, we can present, in terms of where we are and how we are tracking. So thank you.
Thanks very much. We have time for one more comment or question, and then I'm going to ask you to respond as part of your closing remarks.
Okay. This is just a quick comment. My name is Jeff Sitwa from the Oram Institute. Fatima, you made a comment at the beginning to say we are being used. And in an ideal world, we as researchers were expecting that there would be a good health research agenda for South Africa, and that it is well funded, that all of us who are researchers know what are the key research areas from the agenda, and that that research is funded either from South Africa or from the Africa CDC for all the problems that are in Africa. But this is not the ideal situation that we find ourselves in. We find that we have to respond to international health agencies who are releasing the call for proposals and are putting in money for us to do research. But they tell us what research they would fund, and we are in a corner. So I accept the concept of we are being used, unless if we move forward in future and allocate more money than what the international agencies are allocating to us. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We have about 5 minutes left before we need to move on to the end of the program. So Morena, could you please respond to how do we get Gavi to procure more from us, and also the raw production material issue?
Thank you. I'll be brief. There is, I think one of the initiatives is being led through the African Union, which is quite important because, a lone voice like BioVac is not going to change the world, quite frankly, as much as we love the company, but we are a lone voice. So, this needs to be driven somewhat politically, obviously with industry supporting. So through the African Union, there are initiatives that have been set up that are engaging the likes of Gavi aggressively. There is what is called a PAVM. Don't ask me what it stands for now. I do know, but I'll get tongue-tied. But there are initiatives that are there. Our own president is really supportive there and putting a lot of pressure on the likes of Gavi to a point that Gavi says that in December, they will come out with a paper to tell us how they're going to support African vaccine manufacturers. So there is a global network around it. Around raw material manufacture, as I said earlier, that is expensive. And I think there are two ways that we are trying to do it. So we need to get to sort of like low-hanging fruit type of products where they're, call it simple, even though there's nothing simple in vaccines, that we can at least do so that at least we just take the product through. But that doesn't mean that we can't take on more complex like the mRNA vaccine. So what we try and do is to dabble in things that can really just at least teach us the basics, so we have projects like that. And then we also want to get involved into more complex projects. Maybe my last statement, just hearing a lot of the conversation here, and which is quite welcome, is that, when I just listened to this, I mean, it spanned everything from civil society right up to R&D. And that's how we break barriers and silos. Instead of civil society only talking to themselves, or government only talking to themselves, or researchers talking to themselves, or industry talking to themselves, such conversations in South Africa. Globally, I participate in some forums that are more like this, and I've always wished that we could have a lot more forums where you have multi-sectorial people that are sitting around it. But I agree with Fatima. A lot of the issues, because we're talking about health, often the table that is sitting, if there was going to be a chair here, that is consistently missing is part of that. Thanks.
Thanks, Morena. Richard and Fatima, can you comment on how do we get international donors and research foundations not to determine our local research agenda for us?
So I mean, how long have we got? So I think the last comment really hit a lot of the nail on the head. So when we went back to this report that we published a few years ago, 75% of the funding in South Africa didn't come from South Africa, right? So we were doing other people's research. So then that's typically how a lot of the clinical setup in South Africa was developed over the last 20 years, because doing HIV trials and what kind of happened. So until we break that, I think that cycle will continue, and I think that is one of the key things, to come out of today's discussion. But if I use an MRC hat on, about when Glenda Gray came in 6 or 7 years ago, whenever we do co-funded partnerships, they are based on our priorities. It's not based on our international partners' priorities. So it is changing, but it is changing, at the scale that the MRC is at R1 billion a year, as opposed to, you probably could put an extra zero on the end of it, and you would start to see the difference. So I think that is a very, very important element. But, the key factor is that at the current status, we are working on other people's drugs to do our own research, to do the research on those drugs. Until we be making our own drugs and we have our own money to do our own research, that's really the holy grail to get to. And just going up one step that Morena is talking about is, manufacturing in Africa is one thing. There's the how do you make it? There's also the regulatory bit. You need to have regulators that are able to audit facilities and get them accredited, etc. So you could put up as many different manufacturing facilities in Africa as you want, whether it's drugs or vaccines, etc. But if you don't have a regulator there that's to the right level, they're not going to make anything because they're not to the right kind of standard. So the point really is it's a whole system we're really talking about. And I apologize for my slides in the intro. I could have given a slide on maternal and child interventions and all the things that we were doing. I just pictured the COVID because I didn't know who was in the audience. So the first time I've been to one of these meetings. So I can gladly send you information, some of the things we're doing in the MCH space. But I think that's the key message. In terms of the funding, you could put an extra zero on it. Until we're developing our own products, we will still be doing research on other people's products. And I think that is that the two are linked is kind of where I'll finish.
Thanks, Richard. Fatima?
So quickly, just Gavi and COVAX is a Swiss foundation that is not accountable to any one of us. They're not elected, right? When you ask questions, nobody answers. We can't even get access to the COVAX South African government contract, which all of you paid for, which was our money, which we've now taken a massive World Bank loan to pay for those vaccines. So I think somebody had mentioned the word accountability, and I think across the thing, even your license agreement with Pfizer, none of us have seen the terms and conditions, right, with J&J's license. I think transparency and accountability and the ability to be able to question and ask for information. The problem with Gavi is we've hit a what do you think, hit the wall. because even if you ask questions, they have no duty to answer. And I think that's the point that Jeff is making, that international agencies or Gates or whoever, the danger is that these are their priorities and none of them are accountable because they set up as philanthropies or they set up as private foundations. And this is what's happening, is you're having mission creep into the work and the duty of governments around the world. A lot of philanthropists, yes, we like their money, but if they are determining research needs by dangling the carrot of funding, then that is why we are having this problem. So I don't know how we get out of a situation of this extraction, where we not only determine how much funding we need and where we would like to get it from, where we're not desperate, and also determine our own research needs based on community consultation and engagement. Do we really need that extra trial? Do we need this trial now? Do we need that thing? Those are the conversations we should be having, and I really don't know how that can be overturned. There's been some successes in some jurisdictions where their governments have legislated, and things don't just happen because some international agency or philanthropist wants it. It's because there is a public health epidemiological need for it. That's when something happens. And I think that our government has to, you're right, they need to be in all of these conversations and they need to legislate. But they seem to be concerned about other things right now. So if you're going to have true locally determined, locally based R&D, then I think that is the mission that we have to work on, so that you can still do the research you need, whether Alma is there or not, or whether Gates comes there or not. And for us as activists, just the last point of that, the danger always with Gates funding or whoever's funding, or all these philanthropists, including Gavi, is that they're insisting on a model of voluntary cooperation of the pharmaceutical industry. Part of their funding is linked to a demand that you do not take on the systemic issues, that you do not challenge the IP regime, that you do not issue compulsory licenses. So there is a hidden danger in all of these terms and conditions, which none of us can access. These contracts are all regarded as secret or confidential, whether you ask a university or a research institution or government. You never really know what people are signing to and agreeing to. And that is how globally, and with COVID, it was obvious because all of this stuff was being leaked. That is how they're exerting their influence around propping up certain regimes. So it's not just, I would add the third thing to your point, Jeff. It's not just the funding that you want control over and sovereignty, or the research agenda that you want sovereignty over. It's also what happens to the knowledge after. And that is, the knowledge has to belong to the people. So.
Thanks, Fatima. And on that note, we end our panel discussion for today, and we're now going to move on to Steve Litseki, who is the chairperson of the she's the chairperson of the South African National AIDS Control Council and of the Civil Society Forum of that council. And Steve is going to talk about the way forward and also issue a call to action for us after our discussion today.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Good day. I thought you were going to give it a new council name as you were doing the introduction. So I happen to co-chair the National AIDS Council, and I'm also the chairperson of the Civil Society Forum. I do apologize for missing the first bit of the session, but I also did get some update onto this. I was quite excited to hear the panel you moderated, Mia, and thank you for this exciting panelists and this conversation. So first, let me congratulate SATAC and Mail and Guardian for hosting this most important roundtable. I don't know if there is any other better time than now. It's time. And this conversation, it's really important. And I hope it doesn't end here, SATAC. we can take this conversation to the right people. We mustn't speak amongst ourselves, because I actually felt we're also speaking amongst the most converted, understanding, colleagues in the space. But I think there are quite a number of points that we need to reflect on, because there's been what is called tremendous progress. I think our first conversation started from there. We're reflecting what progress have been made, what are some of the achievements, because I think South Africa has also been in the forefront of these achievements, and also looking at what are some of the challenges where millions of people still suffer, and how do we overcome that? But there are quite a number of things. What are some of the characteristics of health research capacity across the country that we must reflect on? And what really constitute a clear national health research capacity? And there are 3 dimensions which I was listening carefully that are also coming out. One, we must reflect on the level of demand for health research, where we need to assess the impact of our own, and I think across your panelists, we're reflecting on the country's socioeconomic and political context, on research demand, on perceptions of utility of research in the country, but also the extent of local leadership of the health research agenda setting, which is predominantly what Professor was reflecting on. What level of local leadership of research agenda setting and prioritization process, including the framework of governing the health research. The second point that also came out is really around the capacity to produce knowledge, that is there. And I think in our country, we do have that capacity. We need to beef it up. We need to look at what are some of the factors that we need to enhance in production of health research outputs, such as quality of research institutions that we have. We've got quite a number of research institutions in the country. How do we enable, how do we ensure that even these research institutions have the capacity to employ and provide the career path pipeline for researchers who can also look at a very diverse range of discipline or, around knowledge and expertise? What laboratory services and capacity are there? The data management capacity also that needs to be considered. That area, of course, also that speaks to, the capacity to utilize the research evidence. Many of us, I was listening to my 2 comrades here who are coming from APA. You've got all of us who are sitting around the table. Some of us are advocates, and we need you as researchers to feed the work that we do. But if at all it's not done in the correct manner, or we don't contribute, or we don't also co-own this research production, we're missing out on how we're feeding each other. You need us, you need us, we need you, and we need to work together also as advocates. And there are others like doctors and nurses and so forth, who then become implementers even in those spaces. So ultimately, in terms of how we exchange, how we promote, how we also really evaluate the kind of quality of research and utilization is key. I think the issues were raised around gaps, around weaknesses, and I won't reflect on those because it's there. They were highlighted by our panelists and really highlighting some of the absence of sustainable elements, the infrastructure and so forth. I won't go into that. But I think what I want to touch on, Mia, before I just make the last points around the call to action, it's what lies the opportunity. At the heart of these discussions, there is opportunity for collaboration. And when we speak about opportunity for collaboration, we speak about even investment in the capacity. So how do we leverage on individuals and institutions? How do we mobilize resources, but also mobilizing resources collaboratively to take action that support the sustainable pathways that we're talking about, but also always move around with what are some of the complex issues that we need to always deliberate on. How do we also leverage, and I think, Hasna was raising this point,
It's not only just about what happens in our country, it's also how do we connect to the regional and to the global context. So forging that collaborative element is very critical in the opportunities that we bring forward. And we need to continue leveraging on that. Experience around TB, HIV, and many other epidemics we're dealing with. And by the way, just a few weeks ago, I was talking to, addressing a session that were pushing around treatment, pushing around investment in treatment. And as a social justice activist myself, and I said, you know, you must also reflect, you're going to put more money on treatment, no problem, we are calling for it. It must be accessible, affordable. But it becomes wasteful expenditure if you're not going to integrate the social elements. Because if I'm going to be taking treatment and I get murdered, and we don't address the social elements in the work we do, it's as expenditure that really just goes down the drain. So we need to think beyond just the health aspect. What are some of the social contexts we always need to be drawn with? And HIV, TB has taught us these lessons. So let us not ignore these lessons. Even COVID, for that matter, when it came through, when there were regulations, people were forced to be in homes, people lost jobs and all of this, but we wanted people to come out to take vaccine. How do you take vaccine when you are reminded how unemployed you are? You know, so all this education aspect and social integration needs to be taken into the interest. How do we then collate our research information and capacity to not neglect other social issues? But ultimately, the essence of the call to action is to our government, is to stakeholders, really about how we double the efforts, in providing an environment that is enabled, but also an environment that is supported. So which means we need funding investment for health research, development, and sustainable local production of pharmaceutical products. We need to align research priorities, and I think I can't emphasize this point enough from what Prof had highlighted, but also the coordinated funding effort for health R&D. Equitable access to medicine and medical products is quite important, but ensure equitable, affordable, timely, and universal access for all, because it can't be for selected few. And I think colleagues have raised the issues around transparency, accountability, the community inclusion, and respect for knowledge holders is very key. I hope this session pumps all of us to do more, but ensure that the transformational agenda is at the center of it. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Steve, for summarizing the session so well and for the call to action. We're now going to end today's events with a vote of thanks and a closing by John Matluli, who is SATAC's Secretariat Lead.
Colleagues, good afternoon. Let me take this opportunity to thank every one of you, in particular the ORAM leadership. We've got the ORAM leadership, which is the current secretariat for the SATAC coalition. We've got Professor Salome Charlambas, who's our Global Chief Executive Officer. Thank you very much, Prof. Salome, for joining us. We also have Prof. Jeff Sizwe. Thanks for taking time, Prof, to come and be with us. And also, we've got Andrew, who's our Director for Special Projects. Thanks, Andrew, for always availing yourself whenever we need you to be present. And then I would also like to thank the entire SATAC Secretariat. I mean, Sakile, Nontlantla, Tanya, who was unable to join us in person, including Kanya, and the entire comms department represented by Nosipo. But again, without our steering committee members, both in person and those who are joining us online, without you, we wouldn't have made the progress that we have made to date. And we would like to say thank you for all your ongoing support. And to the SATAC constituency, thank you very much, colleagues, for always being there and for always availing yourself whenever you are invited to do so. And Mia, thank you very much for steering the discussion and leading us into the right direction. Greatly appreciate that. Fatima, I don't know what to say, but I would like to say thank you very much for that emotional talk. Yeah, it was quite emotionally and eye-opening. Greatly appreciate that. And to Prof. Gordon, I actually wanted to ask a question, but I again thought, you know what, let me give other people to talk. But thank you very much for educating us about how domestic funding for health research and development is being distributed locally. And one of the comments that came out of the call to action was, let this discussion not end here. And I remember when we took over the secretariat, there was a call about a funders forum, which is being led by SAMRC. We were interested really to get more information around the funders forum, and maybe to the comment that both Tando and Yvette raised was, and if we are going to make this funders forum targeting at increasing domestic funding to health research and development, how do we bring everybody? So it's a topic that we will be interested to take it further so that we can understand in terms of if we need to partner with SAMRC, how can we do that? And to Dr. Macwani, this is not for the first time that you have been one of our panelists, same as Fatima, and we understand how busy you are, but you always need time for us whenever we are requesting you to do so. And we would like to take this opportunity to thank you. And lastly, to our national chair, Steve, I know you said you were not feeling well, but nevertheless, you managed to come despite you not feeling well today. We greatly appreciate you making that time. So before we adjourn, colleagues, I've got two comments or two announcements to make. One announcement is regarding the group photo. There was a request for us to take a group photo before we go for lunch, and then immediately after this, and then secondly, lunch will be served at the restaurant. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. And that brings us to the end of this event and ready for lunch, right? Just after the group picture.
I put my hand.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians? Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The